Hello, everybody. We will have some time now to ask questions of Matthew, but also Ameneh and David. What's interesting is that both Ameneh and Matthew, and perhaps David as well, have had images, have had, covers of issues of medical journals. So, I'm incredibly jealous, but maybe I will get there one day. So, folk, I know that a number of questions have gone in here, and I might ask each of you, just very briefly, just short elements, maybe one or two may have more specific questions. What do you think is the best time in your clinical training to do your research training? How do you do all of those? David, could you comment? Then I'll ask Ameneh and then Matthew.
I think the time in your clinical training is less important than the time in your personal life. So if you're married and got children and you can create the space, that's a good time. I think that's way more important. The research can be slotted in anywhere, before your medical degree, during a medical degree, straight after. I think that can happen at any time, but I think your personal life is probably more of an influence.
Ameneh, you're living this at the very moment too. Could you comment a little bit more?
Yeah, so I agree to some extent. I guess for me personally, I did my basic training and then I did research, then I did my advanced training. And I think for me that worked really well because in your training as a clinician, you get to a point of seniority, and it's difficult to go back and be a really junior researcher. But for me, because I had only done my basic training, I was used to taking direction and being told what to do, and so it was very easy to then go back, because when you do start your research, you're starting right at the beginning. You're often, in a less experienced position than scientists who've been doing science for 3 or 4 years when they come to do their PhDs. And so it was easy for me to do that because I was used to calling my consultants and asking for advice all the time anyway, but now I was asking my research supervisor on what to do. So that worked for me, but I know other people have done it differently. The only other practical thing I would suggest thinking about is in terms of grants later on in your life, because you fall into certain categories from years out from PhD. If you've done your PhD at the beginning and then you do all your clinical training, you're considered a very senior person when you're applying for grants, when you're not, because actually all you've done is clinical work. And so that does impact things. So I've got colleagues who have done that, who've done an undergraduate and PhD and then did medical training. And it means that does impact things. So it does matter a little bit from a practical perspective, but I completely agree with David that doing it when it suits you and suits your life is probably the most important thing.
Ameneh, I may just make a comment before I hand on to Matthew, because I know that one of the questions we had was, well, what if I've done my degree before I did my medical training? And that one of our colleagues is in this situation. There are ways that groups like NHMRC and others do take into account your research years versus your years when you might be doing other things, clinical work, population health work, etc. And they apparently take that into account. But the nearer you are to when you have your PhD, the easier it is to be seen as an early career researcher, but it is a challenge. We might talk later about maintaining that. Matthew, what about you? How would you answer a question like that?
Well, I agree with all of the thoughts so far, and there's no right time. It's when it's right for you. And I agree with David's comments that if you are very senior and you've got married and you've got a young family, the thought of going down to the research stipend, which for me was about $23,000, is very, very difficult. It's almost like a quarter of your registrar pay. So I think if you have the interest in pursuing research, I would go early. In fact, that enhances your CV. So when you come up for these competitive scholarships and grants, overseas fellowships, your CV looks far better because you've had many more years of publication. I also agree with the comments that, a lot of medical courses now, postgraduate, Sydney Uni as an example, and people already have their PhDs. And as Ameneh said, you're competing against scientists who are very senior. So either way is fine, and you can't tell the difference of whether someone's done it at any stage. And I think whatever stage you do it at, you're going to say you like it. I mean, for me, I did my PhD before I completed my advanced training, and that was the best for me.
Mm-hmm. Folk, if I could just comment, I did my PhD right at the end of finishing my advanced training, and just after I got married, and I did the PhD, and I went down from a senior registrar salary right down to, then it was $15,000 a year scholarship. And I remember my husband says, I thought I was marrying a rich consultant physician, a pediatrician. And I said, because he'd just moved from, I said, I thought I was marrying a rich lawyer. He'd moved from being a lawyer, partner in a law firm, to working in doing great work, I might add, as a government lawyer. So, but in fact, it's just as well we really love each other, because we've been married for 34 years now. So, so don't expect it to be lots of income anyway. But it can suit. You can manage often, but it is a challenge. A lot of comments to make here. So the idea about how would you maintain a research career? If you're one of those people who've done an MD, if you've done a PhD or something like that before you do your medical career, how do you maintain your research career during that time? Or at least, because we know, that's, how do you keep a hand in so that you're not going to be hampered in any major way? Are there any strategies, or how can you do research while you're still doing in medical school? David, have you got thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I've got a postgrad that's going through that at the moment. She's in the second year of medicine, and trying to still keep research ticking over and be involved with papers and so on. And with 2 children, doing a medical course and doing a part-time, pretty high-level research, it's really, really hard, and it's probably too hard. And I guess all of us have seen the really good FRACPs that have come through and done a fabulous PhD and published a bunch of papers, and then they go into that postdoctoral period, can't get a scholarship, can't get a fellowship, can't get funding, find it hard to publish, and head off into private practice. So in some ways, continuing on to do research, there must be something else that's motivating you, and I guess it's sort of love of the science, or I'm not quite sure what it is, but there are some people that seem to get through that, but a lot of people fall by the wayside because it's really, really hard. You have to be quite, have to be hardworking and devoted and give up a lot of time.
I also think it's important to have, if you're in a situation, if you're a medical student asking that question now, I'd really suggest that you go and talk to some of the academics and research, clinician researchers around you, to see what sort of projects you might be able to keep your hand in while you're going through medical school. But you've got to be creative, you've got to think through and be flexible. But I'd advise talking to people about that. Matthew, have you seen this issue as you in the Brain Mind Centre, as you've thought through those issues? Have you got any advice for people who might have done a PhD already, now doing clinical training? How do they keep a hand in?
Yeah, well, I think as much as David said, that I suppose the motivation is the key. So if someone wants to do it, there's lots of different ways to do it. And I suppose the other thing is, most of us do PhDs and we publish what we think are the great outcomes, but there's a lot of stuff there that you can go back to and have a look at with different eyes. The other thing to think about, and that's why it's good to be a clinician scientist, is we're doing clinical medicine all the time. And although you may have a specialized area, just going back onto the wards, doing outpatient clinics, there's a lot of things that you can consider. And it might even be just a simple case report. And there are now, dedicated journals for case reports. It may be a case series. It may be some, a very, very simple thing that you found interesting. And if you find it interesting, others will probably find it interesting too. So I think I would just try and keep an output going, because as David said, if you have sort of, great publications and there's a barren spell for 2 to 3 years, everyone says, well, what happened there? And what, why were they unproductive? So I think it's good to try and keep a steady outcome, but it doesn't have to be, earth shattering.
Mm-hmm. And folk, I just remind you that it is possible now, much easier than in the past, to develop a narrative about where you've had career breaks, and some of those, or lack of research opportunities. So that's becoming much more the norm now. I do want to turn to Ameneh now, because we've had a question about some of the challenges that women in particular might have in doing research. And I was wondering if you could reflect on that, because I know you've been juggling a lot.
Yeah, and I guess I don't think I'm going to say anything that's earth-shattering. It's probably similar to many of the challenges that women face just as clinicians or just as scientists. And that sort of reflects back onto that sort of the dual role in as mothers or family holders together. And so it's, yes, there are some specific challenges, but I don't think they are limiting challenges. I think they're just things that, as I said, you need to be mindful of. I think for a lot of us, particularly women, we're just used to just doing things and saying yes and carrying on. And it's about sometimes saying no and saying I can't, and taking that time for yourself and saying, look, there is something else that I need to do. I think looking back in my career, I probably would have or should feel like I should have had children younger than I did. And that was something that I delayed because it was like, well, I've got this great opportunity, I've got this great opportunity, I should do this, I should do that. And so that was just a personal reflection, but ultimately I don't think it really changed where I am at the moment. I'm in a good place and I'm happy with my career and I'm happy with my family, but it's just about being mindful that there are multiple aspects to you as a human being, be that as a man or a woman, and that family and friends and all of those things are important, and you should make time for those things. And as Louise said, it shouldn't stop you, because you can explain time out to have children or time out to, you know, be a mother or whatever it is that you've chosen to do. And so do those things when they're right for you. And yeah, just allow yourself the opportunity and the space to be able to say yes to yourself, not just yes to everyone else.
Do you folk want to just comment? Thank you so much, Ameneh. That's just really lovely, wise words. Do you folk want to comment upon, did you feel that you were, you know, how do you keep your clinical skills in while you're doing research training? Did you feel that you were lacking, you know, how did you manage that? Do you think it's an issue? Who would like to answer that question?
I can speak to that, because I think it was actually a huge concern for me when I had breaks. But I think it was more in my head than in reality. So when I had big chunks of time out where I was just doing research, I was terrified. So, you know, my time in New York initially, I had just qualified as a consultant and I'd stepped away and wasn't doing anything. And I was really worried that I would lose that sort of confidence you have in terms of taking the calls, being responsible and all that sort of stuff. You know, I had done it for 6 weeks and then I was going to be off for 1.5 years, or it ended up being with my maternity leave like 3 years. But coming back, it is like riding a bicycle. Your training is really good, you know, training in the places that we train, whether it's New Zealand, Australia, things, we get good training. And so once you've got to that position, you're actually going to be fine. It's probably more in your head than reality. But yes, it was a concern for me. And then it ended up not being, an issue, is what I was going to say.
Okay. Matthew.
I think this is a very good question and a common thing to think through. But my approach has always been to get people to remain engaged in clinical work. So all of the PhD students that I've suggested they do like a day of clinical work, be it a day in, you know, an outpatient clinic, or sometimes in people's rooms, generating income, recruiting patients for their studies. So I think my suggestion would be never try and compartmentalize it so that you don't do any clinical work. Always try to stay engaged. And going back then the other way, when you're doing, if you want to maintain your life as a clinical researcher, you need to maintain the research too. So I would always try and make sure that all clinicians had that access to patients.
Mm-hmm. Do either of you, we had a query here about, Matthew, you had a CJ Martin Fellowship. In fact, that's one of the NHMRC training fellowships that you can do as a postdoc, which allows you to travel internationally as well. Are there, what opportunities are there now? Can people get investigator grants or things like that, and work overseas for part of their time? How possible is it? Does anybody know? Or is that something we could rapidly look up later on? Let people know. I would suggest people go to the NHMRC website and have a look at their fellowships if you're truly thinking about this. But I know that I'm talking to Ameneh in New York. I know that Matthew in particular has worked on a CJ Martin Fellowship. I'm just wondering if you folk know about the portability of fellowships.
Well, a lot of
the investigative grants are almost impossible to get for young investigators now. So I don't think that's an opportunity, really. I don't know of any early investigators that are getting investigator grants.
I know one on the screen, but that's about it. But yeah, it's challenging, folk. It is challenging to get fellowships or what are called investigator grants now in the NHMRC scheme of things. It's this is part of the challenge.
I mean, I think there are some fellowships that are specifically dedicated for doing things overseas. You just have to look for them. I think isn't the Churchill Fellowship a traveling one? And the investigator grants, the early career fellowships also give you up to 2 years of overseas time over the 5-year of the grant.
So that's probably equivalent to something like the CJ Martin.
Yeah, so there are opportunities to be able to do that. You just have to look for them, and I don't know all of them off the top of my head, but they definitely exist. And so if that's really what you want to do it, or you know, there's things like Fulbright scholarships and stuff that you can get to go to, and there are specific scholarships for specific countries. The other thing is, you know, if you have a particular person overseas that you really want to work with, you know, they can probably recommend scholarships with that university, whether it's in the US or the UK and things like that, and say these are the scholarships that are open. So there are lots of opportunities. They're all going to be incredibly competitive, and so you just have to put in the work for it, and you may or may not be successful, or you may have to live on a very tight budget, which all of us have had to do at various times in our lives. So yes, I would say look for them. Opportunities exist. And sometimes you might just have to do it without the scholarship.
Yes. Folk, we're right near the end of our Q&A time, and I've really enjoyed all of your talks and even your reflections in this Q&A time. Folk there, please don't go away. We've got some great panelists coming up, and we can ask some of the same questions and some of the other ones that you've already got there of this new panel of people. I'm going to ask each of the panelists if they could say, just give a sentence or two about why they think being a clinician and a researcher is really fantastic, and then we'll go to our break. I might ask, maybe ask David first, then Ameneh, and then Matthew.
Every day I come to work and I can't believe someone is paying me to do something that I enjoy so much, to learn new stuff, and I'm totally grateful for that. I just enjoy it. I don't think about it. I just enjoy it. Thank
you, David. Ameneh.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's, for me, two parts of the whole. I felt incomplete being just a clinician or just being a researcher, and I'd spent time doing each of those things.
Looks like we've got a
and now
bit of
everything, it feels good now, because I feel like everything aligns. What I do clinically and what I do with research just fits together so nicely.
Lovely. And Matthew?
I agree with both speakers, and I think, like David, I sort of wonder why we're getting paid for this. It's a great privilege and it's so enjoyable. It's the curiosity, it's the sort of the science drive, but also the hope that we can you know, improve patient outcomes. And I think from neurology, the father is Charcot, and he said, look, let's hope that through your work that the outcome for patients in the future is much better than we can give the outcome for this patient today. And I think that's what we can offer.
Thank you all. I've really enjoyed your talks, and I've loved listening to the panel discussion.